Discover how releasing ego identity paves the way to profound inner peace and clarity. We begin with a question: what is the self you hold so tightly to? Is it the voice in your head narrating your life? The roles you play? Or the stories you've built around your identity? And if we strip all these away, what remains? This journey to profound inner peace and clarity is not a search for something new, rather. It is an unlearning. A peeling away of layers that conceal what has always been there. When we think about the ego, it often feels like an enemy. But let's not frame it as something to be fought against. Instead, see it as a well-meaning friend who has overstepped its bounds. The ego, with its desire to define, label, and control, has a survival instinct. It wants to protect us, to anchor us in the world. Yet, its protection often turns into a prison. The walls it builds are made of comparison, fear, and the insatiable need for validation. Pause for a moment and consider this: how much of your daily suffering arises not from what is happening, but from your mind's interpretation of it? You're stuck in traffic, frustrating. Yes. But the frustration isn't the traffic, it's the ego whispering. This is unfair. I should be somewhere else. The ego thrives on shoulds. It tells us we should be more successful, more loved, more important. It convinces us that peace lies just on the other side of achieving, acquiring, or being something different. But let's challenge that. Imagine you've achieved everything your ego desires. Close your eyes and see yourself there. You're wealthy, admired, and accomplished. Now ask yourself, is the chatter in your mind truly gone? Or has it shifted to new fears, new desires, new comparisons? The truth is, the ego's hunger is insatiable. And here lies the paradox: it promises fulfillment but thrives on lack. So, how do we release this ego identity? The first step is awareness. When you notice your mind clinging to a thought or a label, I am this, I am not that, pause and ask, who is noticing this thought? This question shifts your attention away from the ego's narrative to the awareness that observes it. It's subtle but profound. The moment you realize you are not the thought but the observer of the thought, a crack appears in the ego's grip. Let's take a practical example. Suppose someone criticizes you. The ego flares up, defending itself, crafting counterarguments, or internalizing the hurt. But what if you paused and asked, what part of me feels attacked? Is this truly about me? Or is it about their perception of me? In this space of questioning, you'll notice that the need to defend, attack, or withdraw begins to dissolve. Why? Because the ego loses power when it's no longer identified with. But awareness alone isn't enough. To fully release the ego, we must cultivate surrender. This is not a passive giving up but an active letting go of resistance. Surrender means accepting the present moment as it is, without the ego's judgment of good or bad. It's realizing that peace doesn't come from controlling life but from flowing with it. Imagine being in a river. The ego wants to swim upstream, convinced it knows the right direction. Surrender is allowing yourself to float, trusting the current. Now, let's dive deeper. What happens when you let go of the stories the ego tells? The stories of, I am not enough or I must prove myself. You begin to see life as it truly is, not through the fog of comparison or fear, but with clarity and simplicity. You notice the beauty of a single breath, the miracle of a blooming flower, the interconnectedness of all things. Without the ego's constant narration, life becomes vibrant and alive. Here's a question to sit with: who are you without your achievements, failures, or possessions? If you lost everything tomorrow, what would remain? The ego fears this question because it thrives on external attachments. But in facing this fear, you'll discover an unshakable truth: you are not what you do, have, or think. You are the awareness in which all experiences arise and fade. And this awareness, this essence, is untouched by the fluctuations of life. Releasing the ego doesn't mean eradicating it. It's about putting it in its rightful place. The ego is a tool, not a master. Use it to navigate the world, to create, to connect. But don't let it define your worth or dictate your peace. Imagine holding a hammer. It's useful for building. But if you grip it tightly all the time, it becomes a burden. Similarly, loosen your grip on the ego. Use it when needed. But don't let it use you. As we move forward, reflect on this: what would your life look like if you were no longer ruled by the ego's demands? How would your relationships change if you no longer needed to be right or validated? What possibilities would open up if you were free from the fear of failure or rejection? These questions are not meant to be answered quickly but to linger, to invite deeper introspection. This journey of releasing ego identity is not a one-time event. It's a practice, a daily returning to presence. There will be moments when the ego pulls you back into its drama. And that's okay. Each time, simply notice and gently return to the awareness that watches. Over time, the ego's hold weakens, and you'll find yourself living with greater ease, joy, and authenticity. Dissolving the illusion: how presence transcends the ego's grasp. As we continue this exploration, I invite you to consider a profound question: what does it mean to truly be present? Not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. Can you recall a moment when time seemed to vanish? When you were so absorbed in the now that all sense of self melted away? Perhaps it was watching a sunset, listening to music, or holding the gaze of a loved one. In these fleeting moments, the ego fades, and what remains is pure presence. The illusion of the ego is that it ties our identity to the past and the future. It says, "I am the sum of my memories, my successes, and my failures," or "I will be complete when I achieve this or that." But consider this: is the past anything more than a memory arising now? Is the future anything more than a thought arising now? The only reality we ever experience is this moment. And yet the ego constantly pulls us away from it. Why is presence so transformative? Because in presence, the ego cannot survive. It relies on time, on regrets of the past and anxieties about the future. When you are fully present, you step into a timeless space where the stories of the ego lose their power. You realize that life is not happening to you but through you, as you. And this realization is not intellectual, it is experiential. Take a deep breath and feel the air enter your lungs. Notice the sensation without labeling it as good or bad. This simple act of attention is a gateway to presence. When you are fully here, even for a brief moment, you'll notice a stillness beneath the surface of your thoughts. This stillness is not something you create, it's always been there, waiting for you to notice it. Let's dig deeper. What is it about presence that dissolves the ego's grasp? The ego thrives on identification. It says, "I am this thought. I am this feeling. I am this role." But presence reveals that you are none of these things. Thoughts come and go. Emotions rise and fall. Roles shift and change. You are the awareness in which all of this unfolds. And this awareness is boundless, infinite, and untouched by the dramas of the mind. Imagine standing on the shore of the ocean, watching waves crash and recede. The waves are like your thoughts and emotions, ever-changing. Sometimes gentle, sometimes turbulent. The ego identifies with the waves, believing each one defines it. But presence is like the ocean itself, vast and unchanging beneath the surface. When you shift your attention from the waves to the ocean, a profound peace arises. You no longer fight the waves, you simply let them be, knowing they are not you. Here's a practice to try: the next time you feel overwhelmed by a thought or emotion, pause and ask, what is aware of this? This question is a powerful pointer. It redirects your attention from the content of your experience to the awareness that holds it. And in this shift, the ego's grip loosens. You realize that you are not the thought, not the emotion, but the space in which it arises. Let's bring this idea into the realm of relationships. How often do conflicts arise because of the ego's need to be right, to feel superior, or to defend itself? But what happens when you approach a conflict from presence instead of ego? You listen not to respond, but to understand. You speak not to dominate, but to connect. The energy shifts, and what once felt like opposition becomes an opportunity for deeper connection. This is the power of presence in action. It transforms not only your inner world but your outer world as well. Now, let's address a common fear. Many people worry that releasing the ego means losing their individuality or ambition. But this is a misunderstanding. Letting go of ego does not mean you cease to exist. It means you stop identifying with a limited sense of self. Your unique qualities, passions, and creativity remain, but they are no longer driven by fear or the need for validation. Instead, they flow from a place of authenticity and alignment with the greater whole. Imagine an artist painting a masterpiece. If their actions are driven by ego, they may create out of a need for recognition or comparison. But if they paint from presence, the act itself becomes a joy, a meditation. The outcome is secondary. Ironically, it is often in this state of non-striving that the most inspired creations emerge. The same principle applies to all areas of life: work, relationships, personal growth. When you act from presence rather than ego, your actions become more powerful, not less. Here's another question to reflect on: what would it feel like to live without the constant narration of the mind? To approach each moment with curiosity, openness, and acceptance. This is not a utopian ideal, it is a practice. And like any practice, it takes time and patience. There will be moments when the ego reasserts itself. And that's okay. Each time you notice and return to presence, you strengthen your connection to it. As we conclude this part, let's ground ourselves in a simple yet profound truth: you are not your thoughts. You are not your roles. You are not your past or your future. You are the awareness in which all of these arise and fade. And this awareness is already whole, already at peace. You don't need to achieve it, acquire it, or deserve it. You simply need to notice it. Embracing the infinite, living beyond the boundaries of ego and time. Let's begin with a question that could alter the trajectory of your life: what lies beyond the stories you tell yourself? The story of who you think you are, what you believe you've achieved, or what you fear you failed to become. What if all of these stories were like clouds, drifting in the vast sky of your being, without ever touching the unchanging essence of who you truly are? When we talk about living beyond the ego, it can feel like stepping into the unknown. The ego resists because it equates the unknown with danger. But is it truly dangerous? Or is it just unfamiliar? Consider this: every transformative moment in your life has likely come from stepping beyond the comfort zone of your ego's narrative. The question isn't whether you can live without the ego, but whether you're willing to trust the infinite space that opens up when you do. What is this infinite space? It's not some mystical realm you need to seek in far-off places. It's here. Now. In the silence between your thoughts. In the stillness that underlies every moment. The ego thrives on noise, constant mental chatter. Endless striving. Perpetual doing. But the infinite reveals itself in being. This being is not passive, it's vibrant. Alive. And profoundly creative. It's the space in which the entire universe arises. And you are not separate from it. Let's explore this idea practically. Imagine you're sitting in a room. Surrounded by objects. Your attention naturally gravitates toward the objects, the chair. The table. The phone in your hand. But have you ever paused to notice the space that holds these objects? Without the space, the objects couldn't exist. Similarly, your thoughts and experiences arise in the space of your awareness. When you identify with the objects, the thoughts, the roles, the emotions, you feel confined. But when you shift your attention to the space, you experience freedom. This shift is the essence of living beyond the ego. It's not about denying the reality of your thoughts or experiences, but seeing them in their proper context. A thought is just a thought. Not a definition of who you are. An emotion is just energy moving through you. Not a permanent state. When you stop clinging to these transient phenomena, you begin to live from the infinite, not the finite. Here's a question to contemplate deeply: what would it feel like to exist without boundaries? Not the physical boundaries of your body, but the psychological boundaries created by the ego, the idea that I am separate from you. I am limited to this identity, or I am confined by my past. The moment you see through these boundaries, life transforms. You realize that the same awareness animating you animates everyone and everything. Separation dissolves. And with it, the need for comparison, judgment, or conflict. Let's bring this into a real-world context. How does living beyond the ego change the way you approach challenges? The ego sees challenges as threats to its identity or comfort. It reacts with fear, resistance, or aggression. But from the perspective of the infinite, challenges are simply opportunities for growth. They're not happening to you, they're happening for you. Each challenge is like a wave in the ocean, momentary and ultimately inseparable from the vastness of your being. Consider a time when you faced a difficult situation. How much of your suffering came from the situation itself? And how much came from the ego's resistance to it? The ego says, "This shouldn't be happening," or "I can't handle this." But presence says, "This is what is. How will I meet it?" In this shift, you move from resistance to acceptance. From fear to clarity. You see the situation not as an obstacle but as a teacher. Living beyond the ego also transforms your relationships. The ego often uses relationships as a way to reinforce its identity, seeking validation, control, or superiority. But when you live from the infinite, relationships become an expression of love, not need. You connect with others not to complete yourself but to celebrate the shared essence that unites you. Imagine the freedom of loving without attachment, of giving without expectation, of being with others without trying to change or fix them. This doesn't mean relationships become perfect or free from conflict. But the way you approach conflict changes. Instead of seeing it as a battle to win, you see it as an opportunity to understand, to grow, and to deepen your connection. You listen not with the intent to respond but with the intent to truly hear. You speak not from the ego's need to assert itself but from the heart's desire to connect. Now let's address a common concern: how do we balance living beyond the ego with functioning in a world that often seems driven by ego? The answer is integration. Releasing the ego doesn't mean rejecting the world or withdrawing from it. It means engaging with the world from a place of wholeness rather than lack. You still pursue goals, but not to prove your worth. You still take action, but not out of fear. You still play roles, but you don't confuse the roles with your true self. Imagine a great actor who plays many roles on stage. They fully embody each character but never forget that they are not the character. Similarly, you can navigate the roles of your life: parent, partner, professional, while staying rooted in the awareness that transcends all roles. This is not escapism, it's mastery. Here's a final question to carry with you: what would your life look like if you lived as the infinite awareness you truly are? Not as a concept or belief, but as a lived reality. How would your actions change? How would your relationships evolve? How would your experience of life itself transform? As we close this exploration, let's ground ourselves in this truth: you are already whole, already free, already infinite. The ego's stories are like waves on the surface of the ocean. They may ripple, crash, or calm, but they never touch the depth of your being. To live beyond the ego is to remember this. Moment by moment, breath by breath. You don't need to seek the infinite, you are the infinite. All that's required is to wake up to this truth and live it. Let this awakening not be a destination but a journey, one you embark on with curiosity, courage, and an open heart. The path is not always easy, but it is always worth it. And in each step, you are not alone. We walk this path together, as one awareness, one being, one infinite essence.